in every community a group of angelic troublemakers.
Social justice, power hour, power hour, power hour. Social justice, power hour, power hour, power hour.
To our friends on the East Coast, good afternoon. To our friends in the West, and good in-between time to our friends in the in-between spaces, which we all find ourselves more and more these days. Welcome to the Social Justice Power Hour. Welcome to the virtual headquarters of the Byerussen Center for Social Justice. My name is Robert Seda-Schreiber. I am the chief activist here and your host for this evening, as I have been for the past 250 some odd episodes, and many of them very odd indeed. We have not missed a night since the pandemic started. We have been here with you every weeknight since March of last year, over 250 episodes. And we thank you all for being with us tonight. Those of you for the first time looking for a great conversation about public defenders, those of you who have been with us sporadically when the interest of the guest piques your attendance, and for those of you that have been with us, there are a few of you who have been with us every single night, and I cannot tell you what that means to us, what an honor it is that you join us and that you support the Power Hour. Tonight we have a very special program. Tonight we have Sara Mayeux, who is the author of Free Justice, which is a history of the public defender in 20th century America. It's going to be a really lightning conversation. It's going to be a really very important conversation about public servants, people who are doing good works for the people, and sometimes, many times, oft times, are not appreciated for the work that they do for many reasons, and we'll get into that with Sara when she joins us in just a minute. But since you are all here at the Power Hour, I do want to share with you what is coming up on the Power Hour. As I said, we are here every weeknight at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific. So coming up on the show, these are some of the things that you'll be able to share and join us for. Queer yoga every Tuesday night. We have Master Jasmani, who joins us and has been with us every Tuesday. For as crazy as I am being here every weeknight for 250 nights since last year, Jasmani's been with us every Tuesday. So welcome, Jasmani, and come take a breath with us, both literally and figuratively. We could use it these days, right? And then coming up on Wednesday, we have Alexander Chi, professor, author, How to Write an Autobiography, just released this great book, essay collection about the positivity of queer sex called Kink. It's going to be a really lightning, empowering conversation. Don't miss that. And then Thursday and Friday, we have a very, very special event here at the Power Hour. Valentine's Day, as we all know, is coming up. Valentine's Day is a day we celebrate love, and many, many people have a wonderful, wonderful time. And there are many, many other folks who feel disenfranchised, who feel marginalized, who feel unrecognized, who feel not heard, not seen, not loved. So Thursday and Friday night, we're going to do a two-night special event here at the Power Hour. Valentines are various. Love stories and songs across the spectrum. And what we're going to do is on Thursday night, we're going to share stories, love stories, stories of love, stories recognizing love, stories celebrating love, stories talking about the difficulties of love. And then Friday, we're going to share songs and poems, spoken word, and performances along the same lines. So all of our folks can feel recognized, all our folks can feel respected, all our folks can feel seen and heard, and yes, indeed, loved. We're going to have a very, very special guest. We're going to have Lieutenant Governor of Pennsylvania, John Fetterman, and his lovely bride, Giselle. We're going to have Jill Sobule. We're going to have a whole bunch of folks coming out and sharing and celebrating their stories. So don't miss it. Come with us. Come stay with us. Come share with us. And then coming up in the Power Hour later in the month, we have Kwame Alexander, 1,000 Words on Race and Hope, Light for the World to See. We have The Brain Defense by Kevin Davis. Kevin is with the American Bar Association. He wrote this great book, Murder in Manhattan and the Dawn of Neuroscience in America's Courtrooms. This is a great, great, great conversation about the law, again, about the use of neuroscience, about how everybody deserves a fair trial and mental illness has to be part of the conversation. Coming up, we have, I'm very excited about this. I just got this book myself, Black Boy Out of Time, author Harry Ziad. Going to be incredible, incredible moment here at the Power Hour. We have Julian Fleischer, luminary of stage in New York, going to give us a concert and conversation like you're not going to believe. The Three Mothers, how the mothers of Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and James Baldwin shaped a nation. Anna Malika Tubbs will be with us. Extraordinarily honored. True Believer, The Rise and Fall of Stanley. Abraham Reisman's going to be with us. This book is going to tell us the real truth behind Stan Lee, who we all think of as the creator of Spider-Man and Fantastic Four and all those Marvel stable of characters. And in reality, there are a lot of other folks involved in that process, and creates rights or social justice as well. So join us for that conversation. And as a Marvel Comics fan and a Stan Lee fan from back in the day, come watch me get my heart broken. But an important information, important truth to be told. And Mutts, you all know the comic strip, beautiful, beautiful strip that celebrates animal activism, environmental friendly, and Patrick McDonald will be with us. And I cannot wait to talk to him about all the great work that he's done. That's just some of the highlights that we have coming up in the Power Hour. We hope that you will join us each and every weeknight here at 7 p.m., 4 p.m. Pacific. But tonight, Sara Mayeux is Associate Professor of Law and History at Vanderbilt University and author of Free Justice, A History of the Public Defender in 20th Century America. Every day, in courtrooms around the United States, thousands of criminal defendants are represented by public defenders, lawyers provided by the government for those that cannot afford private counsel. Often taken for granted, modern American public defenders are underfunded, overworked, causing inadequate representation for our most vulnerable populations. This book, Free Justice, illuminates how these conditions, often attributed to recent fiscal emergencies, have much deeper foundational roots indeed. Author Justin Driver says, Sara brilliantly uses the contested history of public defenders as a lens to examine and illuminate American conceptions of democracy, liberalism, socialism, and even our broader political culture. Free Justice marks the dazzling debut of a supremely gifted legal historian. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming this supremely gifted legal historian to our Bayard Rustin Center for Social Justice Power Hour. Sara, thank you so much for being with us tonight. We are so thrilled and honored to have this conversation.
Hi, thanks for having me.
It's really a pleasure. And gosh, I have so much to ask you about. In full disclosure, as folks in our legal friends would say, full disclosure, my lovely bride is a public defender. So some of my questions may come from a more personal space. So forgive me if it becomes too much of a, this is a life I've lead. This is what I know. This is what I've witnessed from being inspired by her work each and every day for so many years.
Great. Well, yeah, that's great. I enjoy getting to talk to people that do have personal experience with this history. So I'm looking forward to it.
So let's start with you, though. How did this first spark for you? What was it about this story, this history, public defenders in general? What was it that brought you to this journey?
So I think there are a couple ways I got into this. So one most obvious way is that I went to law school and interned with the public defender's office in San Francisco my first year of law school. So I didn't really know very much. I mean, I had this sort of like, vague notion of what I thought the criminal courts were like, but that was the first time I had been sort of, going to the courthouse every day and seeing what they were really like and seeing what public defenders did. So partly I just became very curious about the institution in that way. And I knew that the public defender, particularly in California, has this very long history that goes back about 100 years. So I was curious about that history. But then I also was a history major in college and studied, like European history and debates about communism and fascism and democracy and all of these kind of big ideas. And what I started to realize is that that you could connect this story about the public defender, which might seem like a sort of specific institutional technical thing about rules of procedure and the legal profession, was actually very connected to these big 20th century debates about democracy and freedom and the meaning of equality and fairness and all of these things. So it offered me a way to connect kind of what was going on today that I was interested in with certain themes in history that I was also very interested in. So that's kind of what the book is about. The title is Free Justice, which is kind of a double meaning. So there were advocates that used that phrase, free justice, to advocate for public defense, meaning like literally free. So for people who didn't have the means to pay for it, but it also plays on this idea of democracy and the idea that fair courts became defined as essential to kind of what it means to live in a democracy or a free country, which was a big, a phrase that we hear a lot in the United States. So, yeah, so those are some, I don't know, those are some different ways that I got into this. It's hard to even, now that I worked on it for so long, it's hard to exactly remember all the twists and turns along the way. And I also want to emphasize too, the subtitle is A History of the Public Defender. So it's definitely not the history. I hope that this in part, encourages people to write more books about this and about this very interesting history, examining, people and dimensions that I didn't get to in my book. So, so it's certainly only one slice of a much larger history.
Yeah, that's one of the things I really do dig about the book, is that it does invite more people to be involved in the story. It does invite more people to say, okay, now I want to pull at this thread, and hopefully we'll create a tableau of all these histories, and they'll all work in conjunction with one another. And you do make that pretty crystal in the. So let me ask you this: why are, and here's where I get personal, why are public defenders considered or treated as pariahs in our modern society? Why don't they get the respect that they obviously deserve? They're doing a tremendous public service, and yet they seem to be shunned at almost every turn.
Yeah, well, I think so. Partly what's also extra frustrating about that is not only that they are kind of overlooked, if not actively kind of seen as doing something that's kind of sketchy by some members of, by some people, or certainly underfunded, under-resourced. At the same time, though, the the Supreme Court and the elite sort of American Bar Association, these sort of very high-profile national organizations, at least rhetorically, often really elevate public defenders and talk really, there's all this lofty rhetoric about how equal justice is so central to American democracy and public defenders are so essential to fulfilling the promise of equal justice, et cetera. So there's this real disconnect between the rhetoric that you hear and then the sort of reality of what public defenders' working conditions are like today. And that was part of also what I was interested in, because when I was in law school, which was like 10 years ago now, there was all this talk of the indigent defense crisis. And so I thought, oh, well, what was the time, before the crisis? I thought I might be able to find some time when this was all working really well. And I did find, different times where the history looked not exactly the way that it does today. But what I found was that this sort of crisis is not a kind of short-term thing where, suddenly there was like a funding shortfall that started that corrupted what had been a sort of well-functioning set of institutions, but rather that almost from the very beginning of the existence of the public defender, there already were these debates we hear now today about, caseloads and funding and what their role should be, and what, how what they're doing fits in with what the rest of the legal profession is doing. And, I think in one sense, there are just sort of general questions that attach to criminal defense attorneys generally, in terms of like, how do you defend people accused of these horrible crimes? And I don't actually think lawyers themselves are that. I think that's a question that often troubles the general public. I think lawyers themselves aren't really troubled by that question, because they have this conception that everyone's entitled to due process and you're presumed innocent. And even if you're guilty, you're still entitled to a fair process, and someone to advocate on your behalf in terms of sentencing and all of this. But nevertheless, lawyers, like corporate lawyers in particular, I think often in the early 20th century, when my book begins, were sort of settled by the public defender, or even by the very idea that the government would be hiring lawyers to also basically argue on the other side of the government in criminal cases. And there was this worry that it looked, too much like socialism, or this is opening the door to government takeover of the legal profession. And so all of this kind of so basically, I think the legal profession kind of always saw public defenders as like a little weird and sort of out of step with how they thought of what lawyers were supposed to do, which was represent private clients that pay them to make arguments on their behalf. And that's not what public defenders do. So, so there's a lot of reasons, I think, why elite lawyers or corporate lawyers are kind of, Supreme Court justices, people at the very people who are deemed, although, I think not necessarily, I'm not endorsing this, but I think people who often are seen as the kind of most prestigious members of the legal community always had a hard time sort of making sense of the public defender in the early 20th century. And so then by the time they decided that they do think there should be public defenders, they still were kind of they still were kind of fuzzy about it. So they would say, oh, everyone's entitled to the right to counsel in this very lofty sense, right? Everyone's entitled to equal justice. The Constitution guarantees the rights of criminal defendants and all of this. So they would prefer to talk about it in that way, but they never really necessarily wanted to discuss the sort of nitty-gritty questions about, well, okay, who's going to pay for this, and what level of government is responsible, and what are the remedies if the government's not allocating adequate resources to this. What are we going to do about the fact that that like, how are we going to fund all of these offices? Are we going to provide enough public defenders to provide really individualized advocacy in every case? Or are we just going to kind of create public defenders, but then overwhelm them with so many cases that they can't really do that much necessarily, or as much as they might like to for individual clients? So all of those questions about implementation, I kind of argue in the book, were never really settled or addressed by the legal profession. And so therefore we have what we have today, which is kind of what your question gets at, which is we have public defenders in most of the country, and they do very important work in, tens of thousands of cases a year, and they're in theory sort of extolled as very central to fulfilling the meaning of the Constitution and all of this, but in reality, in practice, aren't necessarily afforded kind of the respect commensurate with what you would think, or even the material resources commensurate with what you would think when you hear all of this rhetoric about equal justice and all of this. So, but I think it's because historically, the legal profession has been really mainly oriented in, since the beginning of the 20th century around basically the sort of people who declared themselves the leaders of the legal profession envisioned the legal profession as basically oriented around serving the needs of corporations. And yes, a few lawyers will then go do these other things, but that's kind of what they envisioned as the sort of default idea of what lawyers did for American society. And so therefore, I don't know, they never really were willing to fully have a conversation about these deeper questions about, what should the legal profession be doing, and how should we be providing lawyers to individual people that need lawyers, and that kind of thing. So there was always this kind of structural problem, I guess, with the legal profession that wasn't ever really confronted at its roots. And so therefore, that's, I think, partly why we ended up in the conditions that we still have today. Although I think it's gotten worse, because my book ends basically in the 1970s. And of course, mass incarceration has continued to go up and up since then. So in some ways, it's even gotten worse. But I think already by the time I cover in the book, the foundation for these conditions was already in place. Or I guess the cracks in the foundation were already there.
Yeah, that's the part that I thought was really fascinating, was that this is not a matter of, there's lack of funding, so this office can't do the work it's supposed to do. It's been there from the very, very foundation of the public defender's office. I want to pull at a couple of threads of what you just said, but we do have a question from someone in the comments section. It's actually one of our future guests, Kevin Davis, who's with the American Bar Association and the author of The Brain Defense. Kevin says, "Hi, Sarah. How friendly. To what extent did you find that public defenders are short-timers who spend a few years getting experience and go on to private practice versus those who choose it as a long-term career? What kind of person chooses to stay with it?" And that was actually one of my questions too. I see this a lot in the public defender office. People go there for a notch on their resume, for something that they can look to gain experience, and people will be impressed by a 6-month stint at the public defender's office. But there are very few that stay with it. So what did you find in your...
I'm glad that question was asked, because that actually, so that's actually something I found. There's a very interesting history to that, and it depends on where you look. But in, California, which has some of the oldest public defender offices, and Los Angeles County established what's the first basically modern public defender office of the kind we know today in 1913. And it was envisioned there as a, the part of the progressive era. There's a lot of civil service reform and local government reform. And so this was part of that wave of kind of creating new local government agencies to do all kinds of things. And one of those things was the public defender's office. And I found actually in that office, people stayed for decades, and at least in the in the first kind of 50 years of that office, and they really saw it as a long-term career. So some of the same people that founded the office in 1913 were still there in the 1940s and 50s. But that was very different from what I found in New York and Philadelphia and Boston, for example, on the East Coast, which had a very different history, because there, those were much older, cities with more, they had all of these divisions between like the corporate lawyers and the criminal lawyers and all of this. And so the lawyers in those cities said, we don't want a government public defender. We're instead going to handle this basically through private charities. So they had what were called voluntary defenders, which are basically, I guess, the kind of forerunners of what would now be like the legal aid society model of indigent defense. But in those offices, which are called voluntary defender, that was kind of the idea, was that people would volunteer for, 6 months or a year or 2 years. Very young lawyers just out of law school, they would work for either no pay or very little pay as a way of getting experience, and no one expected them to stay very long, because the idea was that then they would move into their real legal career. And so there was always actually this kind of divide or debate between which of those models should it be. And I actually think it reflects a much deeper debate about what these, what it means to have these kinds of offices. So do you think of this as itself a very specialized mode of lawyering that requires its own expertise and its own skills, and so therefore you would want people to stay in the public defender's office for a long time so that over their career they can develop the requisite skills and expertise that are very distinctive in terms of representing indigent defendants? Or do you think it's just kind of basically something that people just out of law school can do? It's not that complicated, and it's kind of a way to get experience for when you go represent, the corporate clients or the criminal defendants that are paying you. Is it kind of practice for like the real cases down the road? And so I think the ideal, after the 1960s and 70s, the ideal increasingly was that these would be long-term career positions, and it would be more on the model that you would develop specialized expertise and that it wouldn't just be like a revolving door. But now I think the reason why people don't tend to stay in these positions often is not because they're not necessarily committed to it or think of it as a career when they start, but that they get burned out, very quickly because the conditions are so difficult, and you feel like you're kind of, I think a lot of people get sort of, it's either they just get burned out or they become disillusioned, or it's just not what they thought it would be, or it is what they thought they would be, but they just can't imagine doing it, for years and years. So I think the reasons why people stay in these positions have changed, somewhat over time. But what I do think is interesting about the history is that also, was something that lawyers pretty explicitly debated and had different visions about, whether this should be a kind of short-term way to get experience or whether it should be a distinctive type of legal career. And so I don't know. So there's certainly then by the 80s and 90s, which is outside of the time frame I really cover in the book, but there then started to be a lot of research by law professors and legal scholars about this phenomenon of burnout among public defenders, and kind of how could you develop training and support programs to sustain public defenders over a longer term career. And so I think the aspiration now is more in the direction of hoping that people can make a career out of this. But I think, again, the reality is, I think that aspiration is at odds often with the reality on the ground.
So it's interesting because there's no national model for public defenders. It varies greatly from not only from state to state, but from office to office. And one would think, especially in this arena, there should be some sort of basic model to go by, shouldn't there?
Well, yeah. So that also is, I think, a product of the history that I discuss, which is, well, it's partly a product of the structure of the United States, which is this federalist, this weird kind of federalist hybrid where you have a federal government and people have federal rights under the Constitution, but nevertheless, a lot of things are still left to local and state governments and criminal courts for the most part. Although there's, of course, there is a federal criminal justice world, but most of the day-to-day criminal justice is handled by the states and by local jurisdictions. And so in part, it's not just public defenders, but prosecutors, police, criminal, what the substance of criminal law, how the courts operate, probation, all of these things are extremely localized and vary quite a bit from place to place. But with the public defender, it's also true that there's a lot of variation because of the nature of the right to counsel. So in 1963, the Supreme Court held, in a very famous case called Gideon versus Wainwright, that the Constitution requires that the court has to appoint counsel in every serious criminal case. And so that meant, although there had been public defenders before 1963 in some places, after 1963, that meant that, every state now knew that we have to make sure that there's counsel in every case. And so that is a big incentive to establish a public defender if you don't have one, or expand, whatever public defender you might have. So there was a lot of growth in just the sheer numbers of public defenders in that period right after Gideon. So before Gideon, there were still a lot of parts of the country where there weren't public defenders, or they were these private, small sort of charity organizations that I mentioned. But then by 1973, which is only 10 years after Gideon, nearly 2/3 of Americans lived in a county or a jurisdiction where there was now a public defender. So it's not everyone, but it's more than half of the population. So it becomes much more common that there are public defender offices, but they do vary quite a bit in terms of how they're set up. Who are they ultimately accountable to? Some public defenders are elected. Typically, though, they're appointed or some kind of civil service or local government position. But there are places where the public defender is elected in the way that district attorneys are elected. Some states have a statewide public defender, particularly in smaller states, whereas some states leave it to each local county or each city to figure out. And then that's not even to get into the funding, which is also totally varies from place to place. And some states provide state funding. Some states, again, leave it to the counties to fund however they can figure out how to fund it. So yeah, it's totally, it totally depends on where you are. And that's because partly the Supreme Court, is limited to saying, okay, there's a constitutional right to this, but then they didn't really say that much about how that should be implemented. And despite efforts by advocates over the years, the Supreme Court has never really wanted to spell out sort of concrete, standards of like who exactly is supposed to be funding this, or how this is supposed to be institutionalized exactly. So there was this sense that like, well, we'll leave it to the legal profession and we can trust them to figure this out. And I don't know that that was true, but that's kind of how it has worked out. Now, one thing that I will mention, though, is that there was for a long time, an effort, or at least discussion, about creating a federal center of some kind, or an agency within the federal government that would be like a center for defense services or something like that, which would not have the ability to directly dictate to states what they should do, but would centralize kind of training and best practices, and could provide dedicated federal funding. So that way, hopefully, you would eliminate some of the discrepancies that exist currently between state to state in terms of how much funding is being provided. And I think it wouldn't be, compared to what the federal government spends on, the military, or even what the federal government provides in grants to local police departments, for example, it would really be very easy and not a huge, it would be a pretty trivial percentage of the federal budget overall to basically sit for Congress to say, okay, from now on, this is a federal constitutional right, so we're going to take over paying for this and give out federal grants or federal appropriations to local public defenders. And then if they did that, they could also attach conditions to the funding that might help to enforce some uniform federal standards or nationwide standards, for better or worse. That's kind of what Congress has the power to do, that any given county or state doesn't necessarily have the same amount of resources and leverage to do. But those efforts historically always fizzled out. There was a bill that Ted Kennedy and the American Bar Association had worked on in the 80s about this, but they never really went anywhere. I'm kind of wondering if maybe with this new Biden administration, and particularly Kamala Harris, who I actually am not a huge fan of Kamala Harris historically, but she does, because she did work as a prosecutor, I think she does have an understanding of the issues that public defenders confront, and did, when she was running for president in her own right, did speak a little bit about kind of maybe the possibility of federal funding or new sources of funding for public defenders. So if anyone, who has connections to Congress is listening, I think one very helpful thing that we might see from the current administration and the current congressional majority would be to revive or go back and revisit some of those legislative proposals to create a kind of federal center, a federal funding stream that would provide a way to, lift the floor, as it were, so that defendants in, rural Louisiana, for example, where the conditions are not great for public defenders anywhere, but they're especially bad in the rural South and in a lot of places that, have very inadequate and convoluted funding mechanisms for indigent defense. And so I think that the federal government could do a lot of good if it wanted to step in this area, but that historically they took this kind of dual approach of creating these very ambitious, aspirational constitutional rights at the level of constitutional law, but then not wanting to get too involved in actually compelling states to put money behind this.
And the tragedy here is that this is literally a matter of life and death, right? And, as Cynthia says, Texas, which is a death penalty state, leaves representation up to each county. And here you have people who need this as a matter of, it's a life-saving defense, and they're not getting the resources they need to, again, save people's lives.
Yeah, I mean, there could certainly be a whole nother book about, inadequate resources and public defense in capital cases in particular. But I think one unfortunate thing is that there's a lot of overlap, not entirely, but there's a lot of overlap between the states that invested the least in public defenders and also invested the most in continuing to have the death penalty and try to put people, try to sentence people to death. And so there are really egregious, there's this whole very egregious history of lawyers in those capital cases who were appointed by the court and did not really even, I mean, first of all, weren't getting adequate funding, but also often the courts would appoint these lawyers who were totally ill-equipped, uninterested, even a lot of times in their clients. There's cases where where lawyers would literally be like sleeping for part of the trial, and this all goes to the point I was suggesting, which is that nevertheless, the Supreme Court created such minimal standards for what we call effective assistance of counsel. So, like, how effective does the counsel actually have to be? That there was often really no remedy for people who were subjected to this. So, yeah, I think it's especially how kind of egregious the consequences can be in these capital cases. Although I would say, even if it doesn't have to be a death penalty case for someone's life to essentially be on the line. If someone's looking at even 20 or 30 years in prison, or even shorter periods in prison, even misdemeanor convictions, we know, can then have these collateral consequences where you might lose your housing, or become unable to regularize your immigration status, or be threatened with deportation, or have issues with your ability to secure student loans or other public benefits, or child custody issues. So really, any time anyone is facing criminal charges of any kind, in a way, you could say, I mean, it's not necessarily life and death in a literal sense, but really important questions about what kind of life they're going to be able to live going forward are at stake. And so I think, to the credit of, the Supreme Court and the American Bar Association and all of these groups, I mean, that realization underlay why in cases like Gideon, they do describe the right to counsel as so central to what it means to live in a free society, or, to live in a democracy, which is that if the government's going to threaten to do all these horrible things to you, you should at least have a fair shot at presenting your side of the case, and have an advocate on your behalf to kind of make the best case they can on your behalf. But yeah, again, I think just the reality in practice, unfortunately, is not that for most, a lot of the reality often is either they simply just have court-appointed counsel that isn't, equipped or interested, even in some of the worst cases, in actually representing them. Or I think more common today, what they have is a public defender who is very passionate and zealous and wants to advocate for them as best as they can, but doesn't have the funding, the resources, also has, 100 other cases they have to go with that same week, and just isn't able to provide the kind of advocacy that the constitutional case law kind of envisions, which are two different things. But yeah, anyway, I'm kind of rambling.
Well, what I think that we're really getting at here, I think that the thread that runs through all of this is that the public defender's office is one of the most fundamentally American ideals that one can really look at in a concrete way. That the right to counsel is what we all are afforded and promised, and it is something that a lot of people, as we said at the outset, shun public defenders because they think of them as being associated with the worst of our society, with the people who are least deserving of representation. But the whole point is, if you believe in the system, then the system will win out at all times. Yet that's never carried forth by any apparatus that the public defender represents, especially funding, right? In your book, do you get to how prosecutors and public defenders, there's such a disparity in the funding and the manpower or the woman power, the person power, the non-binary power that folks are afforded to these offices?
Yeah, so this also, I think, is a legacy of, I think this is largely a legacy of what I was mentioning, which is that in a lot of the country, there had always been this idea that you could handle the defense side of criminal cases through private charity, or even volunteers or lawyers would step in to take cases pro bono. So you wouldn't need to have some, you wouldn't need to have a lot of government funding, or even necessarily any government funding um, for this. And so then once once public defenders are established or expanded, or start to ask, even some of these private groups start to ask for public funding in the 1960s and 70s. And, partly this is, it's just, they're starting now at a baseline of zero, where the legislatures in these states haven't been funding this at all. And so now they're being asked to fund it. So I did find a lot of kind of, I looked a lot at Massachusetts as one example, because I just found a lot of interesting archival documents about how they tried to get the Massachusetts legislature to fund public defense in Massachusetts in the 1960s. And they were very, adept, which lawyers everywhere weren't connected in the same way to the right networks, but they were very adept at getting, foundation funding from the Ford Foundation, and some federal funding from various programs that the federal government was operating, and then also kind of triangulating that to go to the state legislature and say, okay, well, we hired all these people through these other sources of funding, but now we need the state to step in, or we're going to have to fire all these people when the funding runs out. So there was a lot of, lobbying back and forth and things like that had to go on. And I'm sure in every state there's, a different story, but an equally, but the big story is the same, which is every state had to have whatever local lobbying, political debates that they did and continue to do. Again, because there was no sort of uniform national directive or federal source of permanent funding or even directive about how to set up the funding at the local level, et cetera. So every locality and state had to kind of negotiate over this kind of in their own way, and they all came to different conclusions. And then at the same time, meanwhile, the federal government has, since the 1960s and 70s, been very interested in funding police and prosecutors' offices. And so in the period I look at, there was this federal agency, the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, that provided grants, huge amounts of money to police and prosecutors, and a little bit of money to indigent defense in the 1970s. But that agency doesn't exist in that exact form, but there's still a lot of different ways that police and prosecutors can access not only local and state funding, but very generous grants of funding and equipment and et cetera from the federal government. And public defenders just didn't really have that ever in the same way. And so they have always had to kind of cobble it together in different ways. But I think, there are certainly times and places where you can go back and look and see that the discrepancies between, for example, public defender salaries and prosecutor salaries. So there's some times and places, in the past 100 years where they were actually fairly equal in that regard in a particular jurisdiction. And then there's other places where it's like, prosecutors are getting paid many multiples more than public defenders of the same seniority level. So it all, I guess, boils down to this common theme, which is that all of these questions and details have really just been left to the locality and the state. And so I don't even think it necessarily, it doesn't even, it's not even necessarily always predictable in the ways you might think along sort of political lines, like which states are most generous or least generous in terms of funding. I mean, sometimes it does, but sometimes it's a little more haphazard, or there are different weird local factors that play a role. But basically, it's just all the details of funding are sort of at the mercy of whatever advocates are able to do within a particular state often.
So, and this may be beyond the scope because I know that your research and your book ends in the 70s, but there are a vast number of spaces across the United States that don't even have public defender's offices. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, I mean, it depends, I guess, how you measure it. So I think if you looked by population, because most people live in cities or more urban areas, and so I think most people live somewhere where there's a public defender. But it's true that there are lots of places that don't have a public defender, or what I should say is every jurisdiction has to provide the right to counsel in some way, but there are some places that still rely on contracting out with private counsel to handle those cases, or appointing private counsel pro bono, or they have sort of less. When I use the word public defender in the book, what I'm really talking about are a centralized agency or office that's permanent, where the people are permanent salaried public employees, and that's all they do is full-time, is represent indigent defendants. And that kind of office exists in most, although not all, big cities in the United States. And even in the past 10 or 20 years, a few cities that didn't used to have public defenders of that kind, such as New Orleans, have started them, although there's a whole separate, totally fascinating recent history about those kind of newer offices and the struggles that they've had to go through to get themselves established and that kind of thing. But yeah, so it's true that there are still some places where this idea of the sort of full-time institutionalized public defender never caught on in the same way, and so they've still continued to rely on these other mechanisms. But for example, like it just really depends where you are. Like in California, there are a couple counties that are weird and don't have a public defender, but almost every county in California has a public defender because they have such a long history with it. Whereas conversely, in some parts that states that are more rural, there's much more variability. And in the South in particular, even in the cities, there was this, I don't know, there was more of an effort to continue these more informal case-by-case appointment methods, relying on the private bar much longer.
So we're coming down to the end of our hour, and I'm so sad because there's so many more things I want to ask you, but I do want to remind our folks at home who are watching, this is the book we're talking about, Free Justice, A History of the Public Defender in 20th Century America. And Chris is going to show you the link. Chris is our dedicated volunteer in our comment session. Thank you, Chris, for being with us. And we have a bookshop.org link where you can purchase all the books from the lawyers and authors that have been on the show. And we like bookshop.org because they give back to independent bookstores in your area when you order. So please look for this book by Sara that we're talking about all hour. So to you, in your research, what was the most successful model? Was it, and a follow-up, was it because of funding, or was it because of structure, or was it because of another factor entirely?
Yeah, so I actually think, I think obviously you'd have to define what criteria for success you want to use. But I actually think in terms of having well-funded, long-term career, like public defenders who felt like they could develop, had a certain status within the community and were regarded as legal experts in their community and worked in the public defender's office for many, many years and were able to have not get rich, but were well paid and had kind of a stable professional career as a public defender. If that was your model, I would say the early Los Angeles County public defender was very successful at that. I actually don't talk about them a ton in this book, but I have a separate article about an early Los Angeles County public defender. But I would counter that there were, that office was also very much a product of its historical moment in other ways that we wouldn't probably want to replicate. So it was basically all white men that they would hire at the time. They were not super well connected with, they represented and they provided what seems to have been very assertive advocacy on behalf of poor people in Los Angeles, and that at the time included a lot of Mexican American immigrants, for example, but they weren't super well connected with those communities and didn't provide what a lot of public defenders would now see as the gold standard, which is holistic defense, where you're really seeing yourself as helping your defendants with a lot of different issues that they might be experiencing, not only just kind of limiting yourself to, I handle your criminal case and that's it. So I think if we could somehow combine, this is getting out of my wheelhouse as a historian, but if I wanted to talk about the present, I think if we could somehow combine the kind of resources and professionalism of some of those early progressive era public defender offices with a more kind of contemporary appreciation for representation and diversity along, race, class, gender, sex, sexual orientation, et cetera, both in terms of hiring lawyers and other people to work in the office, but also making sure that you're working with the communities that you're representing, and understanding their needs and how you can collaborate with advocates and activists that are already in those communities. So if we could somehow combine those things, I think that might be a good model going forward. And I think that is, in a way, although I don't know that they would phrase it the way that I have, I think that is the aspiration of a lot of public defenders' offices today. But I think we would have to fix these structural problems of the funding to make that fully a reality. And
do you see that as a potential future? Do you think that the public defender's office really has a chance to finally garner the respect it deserves and the platform that it needs to do the job that it needs to do?
Well, I can't predict the future, but I think that
I know historians. Historians are the best at predicting the future. So,
no, I think there is a lot of potential right now, because one thing that is, I think, happening a lot right now is that public defenders see themselves as part of what we're all talking about with respect to policing and mass incarceration and Black Lives Matter. And I think to the extent that I don't know, that we can think about public defenders as part of all of those conversations, I think there is a lot of potential to kind of continue reinventing and reinvigorating the institution. I think that the other possibility, which is kind of dark, is that public defenders just get sort of subsumed within how people think of the establishment or the system, and they just become another thing that people don't trust or want to kind of, I don't know. So I think to the extent that we can think of public defenders as these kind of weird figures that do work within the criminal courts, but on behalf of criminal defendants and often on behalf of marginalized and vulnerable communities, that there is a lot of interesting work being done to kind of think about how to bring all of that together. So yeah, I think I'm pretty hopeful about, I also teach law students, and so many of them now want to be public defenders and see it as the most exciting and important kind of lawyer to be, which I don't think was historically, was historically not always true of the majority of law students. So I think there's a lot of hope too with this new generation, which is not to downplay all of the heroic public defenders that we've had in previous generations, but I just think there's a lot of exciting potential as well with with the current generation.
So the ideal is to keep the outsider status, but get the money that they need to do the work that needs to be done. And
Yeah.
people freaking realize finally the import of the work that's being done, because it's the very essence of what justice is all about.
Yeah, that's the goal, and I think it's a hard balance, and that's so. But it's not surprising that it's been tricky. But I think there is room for hope in the future.
Beautiful. Sara, thank you so much for being with us tonight. We really appreciate it. This is the book again, Free Justice, A History of the Public Defender in 20th Century America, by our guest tonight, Sara. You've been wonderful. This is such an important conversation, especially now, as you said, given all that we've dealt with in the past year, the past 4 years, but especially during the pandemic, with evictions being so high and people needing representation about those things. Black Lives Matters, Black Trans Lives Matters, all of these issues that have come up that public defenders are at the forefront of, and we so thank you for spending your time with us. It's been really edifying and really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me.
Have a great rest of the night, and hopefully we'll talk again when you come out with your next book.
Thank you.
All right, be well, my friend. So that's Sara Mayeux, everybody. Again, author of this book, Free Justice, A History of the Public Defender in 20th Century America. Thank you for being with us tonight. Thank you and our community for being with us tonight. You are all so important to the Power Hour, because without you, we're not building toward the beloved community that we all hope to. So I wish you the best. We will see you in 23 hours in about 55 minutes. Please do come back. Again, we are here every weeknight, as we have been since the pandemic started, and will continue to be. 250 shows strong, 250 shows to go at least, if not more, because of you, my friends. So please, be good to each other, be good to your families, chosen or otherwise, and most importantly right now, I know a lot of us have difficulty, and many people just today told me, myself personally, I need to do this. Be good to yourselves. It's important. We need you here, and you need to be here. So until tomorrow, my friends, much love and respect.
We need in every community a group of angelic troublemakers.